All right, we're recording
Okay.
now. Let me give you
Three.
guys. Yeah, we're recording now. All right, let me give you guys a little bit of an introduction. I'm Tony Date. This is my channel. I make videos about politics, and I'm gonna be talking to someone with like very interesting political beliefs today. Um, we're gonna talk first of all about Venezuela, what happened a couple of days ago on the 3rd of January in midnight. So, as we know, we know what happened, right? Trump bombed the hell out of Caracas, the capital, and captured
Yeah,
President
then
Nicolas Maduro.
Maduro.
Yeah, so, uh, Robby J, give us a sort of introduction about what you believe, who you are, whatever. Give us a sort of introduction.
Yeah, so I'm Robby J, and I am a friend of Tony Doy. I met him on a server. I met Tony Doy on a server, and I'm also really big into reading and current events. And I'm here to talk about my views on one, Venezuela, two, contemporary issues going on with China, I assume, and three, what I believe the ultimate future of the West is, and why I believe that it's going to end that way. That's what I'm here to talk about. And I also have a YouTube channel that I might start in the future where I talk about alternate history and stuff like that, of course.
Yeah, alright, so I wanted to begin the discussion. Obviously talking about Venezuela, but I want to like hear kind of like your judgment about what Trump did. Like, do you think it's a good thing that he did this, or is it a bad thing, or whatever? I just want to hear like your opinion. If you can make it brief, that would be great. But yeah, what's your opinion on what happened a couple days ago in Venezuela?
Ultimately, I think that what happened was a foregone conclusion because Trump, I feel like if you view this as a surprise, considering like Trump's comments in the past about Greenland and how he wants to reawaken American energy worldwide, you would kind of be like a fool to not expect that people end up taking actions against Venezuela. I feel like that this was inevitable to an extent once Trump got in office and he was going to start reasserting America's wings like they did back in the 60s to 70s during the Cold War. I don't think that it was the worst thing that could have happened because I saw quite a few Venezuelan people were happy. I'm not going to pretend like this was like the worst thing that could have happened to Venezuela because Venezuela under Maduro, even if we were to say, oh, well, Maduro isn't this, you have to acknowledge what happened under his reign. Venezuela's been suffering from runaway population decline, economic collapse, and living standards have perpetually dropped since the death of Chavez. So even if we were to say, well, oh, Maduro is like an anti-imperialist in all these cool terms, and like, oh, Maduro this, Maduro that, oh, I don't think you should have done. You have to look at what the material conditions on the ground were in Venezuela, even if you think Maduro was good, because like you have to say, oh, well, I I just don't think Maduro was a good leader,
Yeah.
and I feel like that this is just part of like the Monroe Doctrine and how American policy in the Western Hemisphere
All right, and
used to
do you
work,
think
and it's
that
like
the
us
Monroe
putting it back.
Doctrine is
Mm-hmm.
justified? Like, do you think the Monroe Doctrine is it justified?
Personally, I think that it is. I think that it is justified because, here's what's supposed to happen, right? I feel like there has to be some degree of order because, look, you say, oh, what a rules-based international order. Well, I feel like in the Western Hemisphere right now, that the United States kind of sort of has an obligation to protect its interests. Look, you can just say this, that, and the third about it being imperialism, but history has shown that all regions need some sort of order,
Yeah.
and that order has to come from within the region, because it's kind of like how China had they said all was under heaven, and all under heaven, including Mongolia, Tibet. I think what that there is in like American world. I feel like there is an American world where like America does have a sphere of influence that would all be under like the American heaven to an extent. I don't think that that's inherently a good thing, but I do think that it's a fact that we need to acknowledge that America does indeed have ambitions at a sphere of influence that would include the Americas being under like an American heaven.
Yeah, I mean,
And that's
it's like undeniable that like America has had, we can call it a monopoly on power, and like it's literally been that way since like Monroe. I mean, you know, the Mexican American War, the Spanish American War. I mean, all
well,
of the interventionism that happened during the Cold War. I mean, we cannot deny that. But like, I feel like a discussion we could have is like about whether America really is putting like order as the way you're putting it, because I would argue that I mean American like intervention or whatever, like I don't think that like it has created more order in the continent, and I think it's actually quite the opposite. In the particular case of Venezuela, I mean, we don't know what's gonna happen yet. Um, but like the way I see it, I think it's probably gonna like create a even more unstable situation in the far future. Maybe not so much in the near future, because like I mean Venezuela has been like a total hellhole for like the last 10 years, and like I guess so like in the next like year of like American administration, maybe things are gonna get a little bit better. But like I think overall, the political climate doesn't really benefit from like this kind of thing. And I mean, it's been the case, I think, throughout the continent. Uh, all of the interventions in the Cold War, I mean, they resulted in mostly military dictatorships that were like eventually toppled. And I think that I mean, it's like obviously a question about like I mean, yeah, it is in America's interests to do this, and America's governments have done this with their interests in mind, and it has benefited them. But I do want to hear like your take on I mean this question of whether America is actually putting order in the region or not. And in a way, I would say that like in some cases it's like even like counterproductive to American interests, or like the kind of like positioning that America has, because I mean a big result of this is that like a bunch of countries in the region, I mean they don't want to look at America anymore. They, I mean obviously we're still a region. Latin America is still a region that is dependent on America, but a lot of countries, I mean, they have been looking at what America has done over here for like the last decades, and I mean, they don't want any more of that, and they're looking at countries like China. They're looking at they looked at Russia at some point, but right now it's mostly China. But I do want to hear like kind of like your take on that. Like if America really is putting order in the region.
for the most part, I feel like if we remove America from the equation, that like look, Latin America would just be horribly destabilized. It's like even if we were to just say, oh well, America is causing a lot of problems and this, that, and the third, you would have to acknowledge what happened that was not under the American eye. There was a civil war in Colombia, 1898 to 1901. Well, this is just like in general. There were revolutions, there were wars all across Latin America, even in cases where like you could say, oh, well, the U.S. wasn't involved. I feel like it's a lot of Latin American on Latin American conflict going on because like I think there was also a genocide in Guatemala back in like the 70s. Should have been like you have to look into like even if we were to move the U.S. from the equation, the system of how politics works with like the Cadillo system and this, that, and the third just means that like you can't just get a quick fix to Latin America's problems, even if you were to just remove the U.S. And second off, I do think American presence is bringing order because again, there is an American world world space, there is definitely an American world space. And in that world space, you would find Latin America and Mexico and all of those places. And if you were to say, oh, well, they can look towards China, they can look towards this, down the third. America pretty much rules the waves. And Trump, Trump has begun starting to like crack down. It's kind of like what you're saying right now, because at first they were shifting towards China, but now Trump is cracking down, right? He's saying, look, Mexico, Colombia, and these places, they're going to be like reinforced into the American world space. And look, it's not an inherently bad thing because this is like part of America's role that they need to ensure peace in their own hemisphere. Because like, what would be the point of like being a great power if like you can't even have peace in your backyard? So I feel like America and Latin America is pretty much just going to pursue a policy where we try to like straighten them out to an extent and then like put everything back in order or back in line under American interests. That's pretty much the plan right now.
I mean, yeah, I would. I mean, I would mention that. I mean, for example, I mean the examples you mentioned. I mean, about Colombia like 100 years ago, and Guatemala, which was like 30 years ago, and under a government that was like supported by America. Um, if we look at like recent history, I mean, I would make the argument that I mean, I'm not saying that like if you eliminate America out of the equation, I mean, magically like Latin America is gonna become like like a peaceful place, and like we're not gonna have any problems anymore, because like that's obviously not the case at all. I mean, I'm not trying to say that, but if we look at recent history, I mean, American interventionism, like for example in Mexico, I mean, the drug war is like a very big, I mean, thing. I mean, right now, like Trump has kind of made it part of like his rhetoric in regards to Venezuela. But like the thing is, like America is like the the way that America operates in the drug war is not that they want to eliminate the drug cartels, because I mean, all the drugs, first of all, are going to America. I mean, they're going to America. People in America are buying them, and that's like their end destination. America, Europe, Dubai, whatever. And American policy in the region, in Mexico, in Honduras, in Colombia, in regards to drug trafficking, it has not been about ending the drug war. It has been about controlling the drug war, because America is an actor that is directly participating in the drug trade. I mean, it's something that benefits them. They're not really worried about, ending it in any way. And I mean, we can talk about like other um, examples. I mean, like for example, in Bolivia, like a couple years ago, I would argue that like the American kind of like semi intervention that happened. I mean, that was like terrible for the political stability there. Um, I think that America's political influence in countries like Argentina and countries like Brazil, it has like caused more political corrosion, and I just feel like the region would be like way in a way more peaceful spot if America wasn't trying to police it.
Now, I know you mentioned like the drug war. Well, I would like to point out that like most of the major like factories to produce drugs aren't in the U.S. or they aren't even in Latin America.
I mean, yeah, I
Most of
didn't
them
say
are
that. I
actually
mean,
based
I
back
said that
home.
like the drugs that are produced in
They're actually,
Colombia and Mexico, I mean, they end up in America. I'm not saying that like they're produced in America.
I was saying that they weren't produced in America or Mexico or Colombia. I was saying that most of them usually come from like factories in like Syria and China, and they're usually imported over here through Mexico as like a third party. That's what I was going to say. But are you talking about Bolivia? Are you talking about the attempt to eradicate the cocoa bean, right?
About what?
I know that there. I know you're talking about Bolivia. Wasn't there an attempt by like the government to eradicate like the cacao plant or like the cocoa plant?
I mean, what happened in Bolivia was basically I was specifically mentioning like the political crisis that happened in 2019, which
Oh,
America
I think.
wasn't directly intervening in, but it was nevertheless like after the situation happened. I mean, America did everything to ensure that the Bolivian government that entered power would stay, um, because they were like beneficial to America. Because prior to that, Bolivia was ran by a government that, as we know, was not aligned to America.
Mm. Well, yeah, the major issue with like the Bolivian crisis is that Evo Morales just wasn't all that effective. I feel like when you talk about these leaders, we kind of have like a bit of a skewed perception of them. I feel like that Bolivia during the time that Morales was like running things, it was it was just not like effective. Because when we look at these places, like we say, oh well, Bolivia, or we say like oh Chile, I feel like people oftentimes tend to complain like anti-American or like oh they were like independent, just like they were like effective rulers. And I'm not trying to say that like if you did you should just be like shot dead for being ineffective, whatever. But the point I'm trying to make is that just because these people say gave out healthcare, did like bare basic safety nets, didn't mean that they were effective as rulers. Because Morales, during the time that they ruled Bolivia, which already was a war-torn country, because in the 1970s there was a coup by a group of socialist officers. If I remember correctly, there was a coup, and there were already previous conflicts in Bolivia. So they took over an already war-torn country, and they did measures that kept the country mostly stagnant. They kept the country mostly conflict ridden, because I know that there were like several conflicts with like Native American groups in the Santa Cruz province, if I remember correctly. So even if we were to say, oh, well, they were independent leaders and they did this, that, and the third, they just weren't effective leaders. And the U.S. decided they would go in and replace them, because we have to look at this from like a U.S. perspective. Because I know, like what you're saying here, it's like, oh, well, they had a strong leader and they weren't taking no bull crap and they were just standing up to America and they're taking control of their resources. But if you were an American, what you would see is just another, like, pseudo autocratic ruler taking over an already war torn country and running it, putting it in a really poor economic spot. Because even if you were to look at like what these people did during their times in offices, they weren't good. I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say Morales was a good leader. All they were just a populist rabble rouser. All they said was like, "Vote for me. I'm gonna give you. I'm gonna go to the villages and I'm gonna give out free healthcare.
Yeah,
I'm
I
gonna
mean,
put
look,
millionaire pension."
I mean, like if we're, um, I'm not really saying that like I mean the anti-American leaders in the region have been like perfect or like that they have even been good leaders. Like I mean, if you want to talk about Evo Morales in particular, like I think that during his term he did a lot of good things. I mean, first of all, like the Bolivian middle class. I mean, the Bolivian middle class grew by a lot. The country's economy diversified by a lot, and a lot of vulnerable groups. I mean, particularly indigenous people. I mean, he was the country's first indigenous president, and that's like the most indigenous country in Latin America. Um, Benefited from him being in government. Like, did he do things wrong? I mean, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of things he did wrong, and I'm not gonna defend him. I'm also not gonna defend like a lot of the leaders in this region that like are just because of the simple fact they're anti-American. Um, but what I'm trying to say is it's not like a um I think it's kind of like a false dichotomy. I mean, it's not like the only two options are like having people like Evo Morales in power, and like the other option is like having America run everything. I would argue that like the first option, having like anti-American leaders, whatever, has like historically, um, been preferable. I mean, there's certain countries where like Venezuela, it completely fucked up, but like it has historically been preferable for the most part, and like part of that is because like the way you see how America has handled a lot of the political situations here, it has only resulted in like more political crisis. And I mean, if you want to talk about it from an American perspective, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, it benefits like the American upper class or whatever. It benefits the government, but like it doesn't really like benefit like anyone in America at all to have like this kind of foreign policy. And it's probably the opposite. Because like there's also like the immigration thing. Like a part of this is immigration, and like America wants migrants from Mexico. They want migrants from Venezuela, from Central America, and like we know that like all of that is like directly like fucking over like American workers and people in the American middle class. So I would argue that like it's not good for Latin America. It's also like not good for um, people in America either. It only benefits like the wealthy.
I will be honest with you, but I do agree that this will benefit the wealthy. But I know how you mentioned like, well, the immigration crisis. Well, guess Trump has been doing quite a few deportations. It's very noticeable, actually.
Yeah, he's not. He's
The
not.
U.S.
I mean, he hasn't passed like the deportations that Obama and Biden did, like yet.
act-
Uh, he has like halted like the entrance of illegal immigrants, which is another thing. But like in terms of deportations, it's like the same thing.
Something really funny. A lot of these deportations aren't showing up is because like some of them self-deported
Yeah,
using an app, and like 1.6 million people chose to like deport themselves away from the U.S. So like that's why they aren't on like the list because they weren't like formally picked out by like a government agency. They just chose to leave themselves. Also, I'm just charging my phone very quick. They just chose to leave themselves, right? So that's a major reason. So we calculate that, and it can be up to 2 million people who left in total. 400,000 who were deported, and 1.6 million who left. And when you consider this in like total, I do believe that there will be like a major dent in the amount of immigrants in the United States, which, depending on who you ask, could be a good or a bad thing.
yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the self deportation stuff is kind of like bullshit. Like I mean, it probably has gone up, but like I don't think it's like reaching 2 million. And like I mean, about immigration, I mean, I'm pro immigration in principle, but like obviously like the wave of you know particularly illegal immigration since like the 90s. I mean, you know that was something coming from NAFTA, which is part of like the kind of like neo Monroe Doctrine policy, and I think it ties into like generally like the kind of globalization issue. But like I do think that like the particular kind of like brand of illegal immigration coming into America. Uh, I mean, there's like a human issue that like is important, especially like the way that like America treats the illegal migrants who like are already there. But like I also think that like as a kind of like macro issue, like I mean, it's certainly like something that like was manipulated and is being manipulated by the wealthy in America because it's something they can like use for their benefit, and that's not exactly like I mean like everyone knows this. I mean Trump was talking about it back in 2016, but whatever. I mean that's like a whole different thing. Um, so we kind of like went a little bit off topic there. So with this thing about Venezuela, I mean it's a fact that like we're basically looking at a situation where the American government is like, telling the whole world that, like, I mean, fuck, like we have power over like everyone else. I mean, we can just do whatever we want, and I mean, whatever. I think that kind of like ties into your political beliefs a little bit. So like, I would
I feel like Trump revealed the United States problem.
reveal what?
What'd you say?
Yeah, I think you like bugged a little bit.
Said what'd you say?
Yeah, you had like a
Oh, you
little.
bugged or I bugged?
You bugged. You had like you like cut off. You were talking about like how Trump revealed, and then you cut off.
I thought you were trying to finish speaking. Yeah, Trump revealed the United States' power level in his NSS, like the National Security Strategy, because I think that he revealed that like he wanted to do something with NATO, right?
Yeah,
So the U.S. has been reorienting its policy towards globalism and neoliberalism, towards just like acting in like the self-interest of itself and the preservation of the American nation
yeah,
solely. So here's where you go. Because he announced this, he said, "Look, there's going to be changes," and he said he wanted to dissolve NATO into a series of U.S. command zones, like around four, that would be directly subservient to the U.S. And he mentioned raising NATO budgets to around 5% of national GDP. On top of this, he also announced plans to impose Monroe Doctrine 2.0. So when it all comes down to it, I don't think American influence will decline anytime soon. I think that the opposite will happen. I think that Western society is reaching a choosing point where it will either choose between globalism or it'll choose between like a Western nationalism. And I feel like we're starting to see the push for like an all Western state occur in part or in whole in governments across the world because Canada is proposing joining the EU. So I think what we're going to witness here is just going to be a split between like the two visions for the West. It's going to be a split. It's going to be either a liberal-led vision or it's going to be a nationalist-led vision. So we're culminating at a point where like, oh, you might say American influence is declining, but America easily has great geography and it has like the political will to expand into Latin America, to expand into Europe. I feel like what we're going to witness here is a total resurgence of American power. I mean, it won't last forever, but I don't think it's going to end anytime in the near future.
well, um, I think though, like, I mean, you're sort of right in the sense that like this recent action in Venezuela has sort of like, I mean, it's basically Trump showing the world that like, I mean, America is still the military superpower, and like they can kind of just like pull stuff like this. And I mean, like, for example, I mean, the gap between America and China, military wise, is still like massive. And, I don't think anyone would like deny that like America is still like an immense amount of power. Um, but I mean, I'm just kind of curious. I mean, recently we have seen. I mean, I talked to you a little bit about this like some weeks ago, but I mean, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. a big part of Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, and like even some parts of Latin America. Um, this is like the big topic, right? I mean, China. Like, I mean, they're all looking towards China, and to my judgment, I mean, I think that's like the big obstacle that like America would have to kind of like overtake. So like, I mean, what's like your take on that? I mean, like, what do you think about like that? Like, do you think it's like overhyped, like the whole China thing, or like,
I'll be honest with you, but okay, let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at it plausibly. So you remember like how back in the 90s there was a man named George Friedman, and he was saying Japan is the next big power. Japan is going to overtake the U.S. This, that, and the third. And there were things in the 80s and the 90s called Asian tiger economies.
yeah,
And guess what? These were economies that were in Asia, and they were fueled by cheap labor, and basically just like they were allowed to just make stuff, make stuff, make stuff, and the economy kept on growing and growing and growing. But eventually their society hit a plateau, right? So what's going on in China? I've read about China, and there's this thing called the 996, where you have to work 9 hours a week for around 90% of the week, 6 days a week or something like that. I feel like that the average living standards in China are way below what they are in the US. And I'm not trying to say Americans are eating steak and lobster every night, but if you read about what the average Chinese person is doing, you find out that the real estate market in China is really whacked up because the Communist Party is selling the land to their friends to build like senseless projects on. Because you read about like how in China there's a whole city of French style palaces. I think like you look at like China, and back in the 2010s, 2000s, they wanted to like do an effort where they would like try to westernize a bit more, and they built these entire cities just full of British and French style architecture, and they sold billions worth of land to the Communist Party. So real estate prices are shooting up because the Communist Party is committing insane amounts of nepotism and just selling land to their friends and such. And on top of nepotism of who the land goes to, there is also less room for the average Chinese laborer to afford an apartment, to afford a house, and it's really worse than in the United States. Because the United States, we have new technology. You can just 3D print a house. Hell, in some parts, you can just 3D print a house, like actually. But in China, they're behind on 3D printing technology, they're behind on land, and they're behind on quite a few things. And the housing market is one big thing. Number two is regional tensions. And this isn't like the US where we evened that out back in like the 1910s, 1920s. In China, they had the blockade the city of Shanghai back in 2021 during the COVID pandemic. And this led to two factions in the Communist Party, the Shanghai clique and an interior clique, which is more conservative. And here's something really funny about the political spectrum in China. In China, if you were to say, oh, a conservative, you would get an actual hardcore communist. But in the US, if you were to say uh, conservative, well, you'd get a conservative. In China, if you were to say a liberal, you'd get, well, a free market. Well, no, I'm not going to say libertarian because this is still the PRC, but you would get someone who is obviously who would be considered to be on the right here in the U.S.
yeah,
Not on the right, so someone on the left in the U.S. You get someone considered to be on the left in the U.S. And this is part of the Shanghai versus the interior divide. So the Shanghai clique, they supported Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao. They're very free market reformer types, while the interior clique, based mostly out of the interior provinces like Wuhan, they tend to be more conservative and elderly. Not to mention the fact that China is rapidly aging, and China has a major issue where around 52 to 53% of its population is male. So, on top of the housing issue, you have to deal with the dating issue. Imagine all the issues people complain about in the West, and just jack it up to 25 in China. There's the fact that there's a female shortage, there's a woman shortage in China. Some people are saying that young Chinese men are angry, and around 55% of Chinese men below the age of 30 are virgins. On top of that, the housing crisis, regional tensions, the aging crisis, it's just a pile of things, not to mention the water crisis. I'm not trying to say the US has it perfect, but the major point is China has its own load that it has to sort out. And on top of dealing with all of those problems, they have to deal with Africa problems. Because even if we were to say, well, oh, they get to start investing all this money in Africa and they send all this aid to Africa, well, on top of dealing with China problems, they have to deal with Africa problems and they have to deal with the fact that they now have to invest billions of dollars in Africa when their own resources in the mainland dealing with the housing crisis and the water crisis are going to be a bit overstretched. So on top of bailing out the Chinese banks, they're going to have to bail out the African banks, and they're building this freeway in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they're trying to do this thing where like they're supporting like African nations. But the thing is, when you read about Africa, they're kind of at the same level as, I'm not trying to be racist for obvious reasons, but they appear to be at the same level as like medieval Europe. Like I don't feel like Africa is like a modern like society as is. It's going to take years and years to develop Africa at a level to where they can be a serious help on China's resources and not just a drain. Because the Soviet Union tried something similar and they collapsed. So Africa is not going to be any sort of competent partner. And you can say Latin America, but Latin America, you have to deal with America. And if Trump is continuing this aggressive posturing, then you can easily see like uh naval conflicts between the US and China to try and get like Latin America back to their orbit. So China has to deal with China problems, has to deal with Africa problems, and now they're gonna have to try and deal with Latin America problems. I just can't see this ending and them being they're gonna end and they're gonna be horribly overstretched from all of this. I mean, what are your comments to all
Yeah,
of that I just mentioned?
I mean, it's not like Japan in the 90s at all. Because, like, Japan in the 90s, it was like a purely economic phenomenon. I mean, they had like no, and they still have like no soft or hard power or like any other country in the world aside from like the other Asian tigers and maybe Southeast Asia. So, like, it's not the same case at all. Because, like, I mean, none of those countries, I mean, Japan, South Korea, whatever, they never like reached even like half of the kind of like influence that China has today. Uh, Not only on a strictly economic scale, but like also geopolitically. I mean, those countries geopolitically are like nothing compared to China right now. And I mean, I'm not gonna deny the things you're mentioning. I mean, certainly demographics, like, that's a big problem for China. It's also a big problem for the West. Uh, it's probably gonna be worse for China in the long term. But I mean, that's a problem that these two places are gonna have to deal with. China and the West. It's the same with like real estate. Um, it certainly it certainly has gotten worse, like, for China over the last year. Uh, it's also a pretty big problem in America and the West. So I think like it's a question about like kind of like measuring the internal problems that like each country has. And I mean, the way I see it, I mean, China definitely has like a lot of internal problems. A lot of them have grown over the last years, but I feel like it's not even comparable to America, like, in any way. And like we're also like not talking just about internal problems. We would also have to talk about how the spheres of influence have changed. And I think in both aspects, I mean, America has got it worse. um, I mean, first of all, in America, there's the social and political problem, which has like absolutely no resolution in the near future at all. And I used to believe that like this aspect of American society was not really as bad as some people say, but like I do think that like the way things are looking, like America's political instability is just like gonna make things worse and worse, and it's making it like a country that is like unable to like have like a meaningful, coherent socio-economic project nationally. And that's kind of like a big difference with China in kind of like the way that like the two countries have like their style of government. And I mean, China, it's a planified economy. I mean, there's like they have had like their 5 year plans. They have like massive infrastructure projects. So like, you know, have like presence in like every Chinese state. And like with America, I feel like the kind of like social political context kind of makes it impossible to have that, and that is a very big issue for America. Um, because if they want to compete with China, I mean, they're gonna need that kind of like internal mobility, and they're gonna need that kind of like internal diversification. Um, because I mean, like for example, like trade wise, I mean, there's still like a massive deficit between China and America. Um, and China, in terms of their internal mobility, I mean, it's like 100 times better and more stable than America, even if they do have their problems. Um, and when we talk about like the sphere of influences, I mean, the fact that America maybe doesn't have it as bad demographically, I mean, yeah, sure, but like that's not changing the fact that like over the last 10 years, virtually all of Southeast Asia, Asian is now China's biggest trade partner. Uh, Virtually all of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and countries like Pakistan, I mean Central Asia, uh, have all gone to China. And they're not in the middle trying to like choose between China and America. I mean, they're very much like firmly with China. There's some countries like Kazakhstan that, for example, like they are kind of in the middle, but like for the most part, I mean, these countries they have already like made their decision, and there's very little America can do to kind of like fix this. And ironically, like a large part of it is because of like Trump during his first term. uh when he like eliminated like the TPP, and like he had like the trade war. I mean, all of those things kind of like isolated all of the rest of Asia from the US. And like I don't see literally any scenario in like the next 5-10 years in which these countries would go back to America. And like speaking about Africa, I mean, I think that like Africa is definitely like on a very, they still have like a long path to cover to like get to like a higher state of development. I mean, but I do feel like China. I don't think the relationship with Africa is like something draining them. Like it's probably costing them more than what they're gaining. But like I wouldn't say it's like draining them. Like I think they have like benefited a lot from it, and like not only economically, but geopolitically, like it would also be very difficult for America to get like their influence back in Africa. And right now, I mean, yeah, like Africa, like I mean, like you can like say they're not a very developed region, so like whatever. But like in like 50 years from now, I mean, like having like an ally in like the Congo, or like like Kenya or Ethiopia, like by then those countries, I mean, they're not gonna be like in the first world or whatever, but like they're certainly gonna have like a stage of development that will be able to like bring a lot of riches and a lot of trade and a lot of economic development internationally. And America is not really like in a good spot at all there. And you know, I just don't really see how these issues you mention, which are issues that like America has as well. I don't see how like they somehow, uh, you know, if we want to talk about like quantifying them, I don't think that China has more problems than America internally or externally. And I also really don't see how that means that China is like gonna lose all of the influence they have like grown, because like I don't think, like, even if these issues escalate, like I don't see it ending on like a in like the Chinese government collapsing or anything, you know. Like you could say the same about America, you know, like with all of the problems you guys have. I mean, like what's gonna be the end goal of that, you know? Like what's gonna be the final result of like all of the problems that are kind of like in America right now?
I think I've mentioned this before, but here is a major thing that I want to mention. When it comes down to like, I'm going to mention America first, and I'll go back to like some of your concerns about like America versus China and Asia and Africa and abroad. But starting America first, I want to mention just one thing: Donald Trump. So I feel like here's what we're going to see. So I think that America is heading into a situation where we're going to see Bonapartism or we're going to see Caesarism. Like, I feel like Andrew Yang is a good example of what that would look like from like a democratic perspective. Because like if you were to read Andrew Yang's platform where he said, "Oh, we're going to give everybody 10,000, we're going to give everybody money, and we're going to depoliticize this," it feels like soft Bonapartism. I feel like American politics are eventually going to end up at a stage where like there's going to be a really big conflict, like just a political conflict that shapes the world, or at least shapes the U.S. as we know it, and it's going to end like so terribly, like for the modern norms of politics, that people are just going to demand something different, and we're going to end up getting a shift towards Bonapartism and Caesarism, where we're going to see a depoliticized society that's built on like the goal of like common progress, kind of like what you see like any sort of like American Bonapartism wouldn't look like George Orwell's 1984. It would probably look more like the modern People's Republic of China, because truth be told, the United States isn't in a situation where like it will collapse. I feel like there's simply too much energy and vigor left in the system to where we just go, oh, collapse. Because like look at how nations such as like Britain and Germany have managed to keep national identities despite all the trouble they've had to go through. I feel like American has been so solidified as an identity that we can agree on, hey, we think the United States is neat as an idea, but we just have differing views on how we think it should be ran. And that's what I think
I mean, I feel
is
like
shaping
the
up.
last kind of like 20 years have kind of like disproved that like by a lot, cuz I feel like, I mean, particularly with like younger generations, like I feel like the label of American really doesn't have like the power that like it used to historically in America. And you know, I feel like social media is like a massive kind of like thing in this area, because like first of all, I mean, you have social media, you have like all of the information and all of the public debate available. I mean, is it really possible to have like a post-political society in a scenario like that? I mean, China, you know, for example, China, I don't think they're a post-political society, and they're they do have like certain qualities of what you would call a post-political society. But like for example, in China, I mean, like there's a lot of very rigorous and polarized political debates. Obviously, not to the extent that they exist in America and the West. But like social media, there is like kind of like the origin of like a lot of, you know, political kind of like conflict there, political debate. And you know, social media there, as we know, is like super regulated. I mean, that kind of like, especially when it comes to political topics. And in America, if you have like all of this kind of like public information and public debate, I feel like it would kind of be impossible to have a, a post-political society. And I mean, just looking at the way that the kind of like identity of like America has been like so fractured, and like in so many ways it has become kind of like uh you know completely, I mean, like the left, for example, I mean, has like a completely different idea of what America is compared to the right. Like even if they share the same basic label of America, like what you're saying, I feel like doesn't work in a society in which like one side has like a different idea of what America even is. Like I feel like the European nations you mentioned, I mean, left wing parties in Europe are like way more nationalistic than the left in America is. You know, in Europe, I feel like it's actually the opposite to what you're saying. I think in Europe there's like a way stronger kind of sense of national identity, and there's a lot of reasons to that. But I mean, politically right now, uh, even though each country has its particular case and whatever, I do feel like the way it reflects politically, I feel like America is kind of like entering a state of post nationhood, while Europe is, uh, kind of like superseding that in a way. But like I do feel like in Europe and local politics, I mean, the kind of like national identity is like way more of a unifying thing than in America, and I just don't like see how that would work.
Well, I'm not saying that it's gonna happen overnight. I wasn't trying. Here's what I'm gonna claim. Right. Here's what I'm gonna claim. So you know we're having major conflicts right now. Here's I feel like we're starting to see this. Okay, so in American history,
Yeah.
you usually see is a cycle. Not like decisive. Like I'm saying it's a cycle, right? And it usually lasts about 80 or so years. And you can see it like, okay, so we start 1776, right? We get the American Revolution, and that overthrew the 13 colonies. So we start with the Revolution, and that was the U.S. getting an identity, and we took Louisiana, we expanded, and then we reached like the apex of our power and unity in 1848, sometime after the Mexican War. And then there was a disintegration, and after that disintegration, we get Lincoln, who was actually a strong man, who, after he was elected, he suspended Congress for 100 days. And that's how it works. We get a phase where there's growth, where there's integration of society. We get an apex, then we get a strong man. And that's how like things usually go. And it happened again in 1860. We had a new order. And this phase was we fought Alaska, we defeated Spain, and that was a phase where society grew, society expanded, and then society plateaued a bit in the roaring 20s, and then we ended up getting depression and we got like FDR. So it's like usually like an 80 or so year cycle we see American history unfolding of. And I think you're saying American doesn't carry the label, but you said that the two sides have differing views of America. And there's not any really strong like separatist movements. Because even if we were to say, oh, there's post nationhood, just down the third, what new nations would exactly come out of this? Because here's the thing, there's no sort of strong Texan separatist movement. Like, I highly doubt the Texan separatists are just going to get AK-47s one day and start shooting at federal officers. Seriously doubt that's going to happen. So even if we were to say, oh, there's post nationhood, or there's this, down the third, there's not really any strong sense of separatism in the U.S. Like, oh well, we're going to secede this like this region in Serbia, Kosovo wants to secede. Like, there's going to be nothing like that. It's going to be sides fighting over what they want America to be like. And we're witnessing the beginning of the Trump era. This is the news cycle. So I think that like what we're witnessing right now in Venezuela is going to mark an era of gradual expansion where the US under Trump and under like future strongmen under him. And again, here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that eventually we're going to reach a stage. And by the way, post-political doesn't mean, oh, there's no politics discussed at all. I'm not going to claim that's what post-political society means. It means that the people who discuss politics have been, or the people who make the decisions have been reduced to a small group of people. It doesn't mean, oh, politics no longer exists. It's like how the Roman Empire was post-political, but there were politics. For example, there was a Roman Republic, there were mass elections, etc., etc. But then you get to the Roman Empire, and politics are mostly decided by a small group of, say, a few thousand men. In the People's Republic of China, there was a Republic of China, there was mass strife, and there were plenty of issues. But now the society has reached a stage where politics are no longer to be decided by the masses, but to be decided by a group of, say, a couple 100,000 men, because China has a large population. So when I say post political, don't think, oh, well, there's no longer political discussions to be had. No, it's just that the people who actually discuss politics have been shrunk down to a very small group. And I mean that like a post-political society, look at like Napoleonic France or the Roman Empire. These are like autocratic societies that are usually ruled by one person who has who has vague popular support. This isn't like a monarchy. The person ruling is supposed to have the vague support of the people or popular support. So yeah. So usually that's what I was going to say. There's an 80-year like arc to how American history works that I've noticed, and a few other people have noticed, like political scientists like Turchin. But again, here is how it begins. There's a phase of growth, expansion, integration. There's an apex. Then there's a gradual decline till we get to a strong man. Because I told you, I'm not saying this to say Lincoln was a bad president, but when you look at it, Lincoln was a dictator who solved the issues that the U.S. was facing in the 1850s, 1860s, etc. Because there was bleeding Kansas, there was the Civil War, but then Lincoln assumed total control over the state.
Yeah.
He so yeah, so I think that when we say, oh, there's going to be a collapse, I don't think that we're at that stage in Western society yet where people just don't think that there's any future for the West or any future for America.
Yeah, I
But we're
mean,
at the stage in Western
I
more.
like I get that. When I was talking about like post nationhood, I wasn't like talking like it doesn't mean that like there's gonna be like balkanization or like separatism. Like it's more like of a kind of like cultural kind of like phenomenal thing. Like I feel like post nationhood, uh, means when we apply it to a society, it means that like people don't really have a unified concept of what being an American is, and it's not a left right thing either. Like it's something incredibly atomized, and that's why like inside the right, like I mean, there's like a million different factions, uh, that have like all shaped around this particular issue. The issue of nationhood. uh, Inside the left, it's not the main divide, but I mean, there's also a lot of groups on the left that have like their division is like based on their differing views of what being an American is, and about like the historical eras you're mentioning. I mean, I agree. I think that's like a general trend. Um, but like here's the thing, and like it's related to what I'm saying. I mean, there has never been a period in American history in which the concept of American identity has been like so atomized, you know? And this is like something like really, really new. Because like even like 20 years ago, I mean, like during the Bush administration, I mean, you generally had like a pretty unifying view of American identity. The war on terror was something that like contributed to that a lot. but I feel like beginning kind of like in the Obama era, and you know, this was kind of amplified by like the polarization surrounding Trump's nationalism. I feel like America has gotten to a point where you know this kind of like identity doesn't really exist collectively anymore, and it's kind of strange, and I don't know what the exact effects are gonna be, but I feel like one of the effects that we are already seeing is that like it's literally, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, it's literally impossible for America to have like a national plan. And it's funny you mentioned Trump as being like the kind of like new iteration of like the strongman, because I feel like precisely this kind of like um corrosion of American identity is what has like prevented Trump from becoming a strongman. I feel like Trump hasn't been able to deal with that correctly. He hasn't been able to deal with the kind of debates that have been pertinent to it inside the right. Like the issue, like it's kind of like a um, not very relevant thing, but like I mean stuff like with the visas, and I mean his migration policy in general. I mean he kind of like he represents, I feel, another kind of like manifestation of like just how like kind of like I don't know how I would describe it, but like of this kind of like non identity that American uh, that like American identity has become, and I feel like that's something we have never seen in America before. It's something we generally haven't seen in history, really. Um, and I feel like I don't know what's your take on this, but like I really like I feel like that's kind of like the thing that makes it impossible for me to believe that like somehow like the American identity is gonna like prevail, and that like it's gonna be able to like survive after like this kind of like political conflict. Like I don't see that happening at all.
Well, to be honest, I feel like there definitely will be some sort of civil conflict. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like there's going to be like just some sort of a overarching piece. There will be a civil conflict. And that's what I think. I think sometime in the future there will be a civil conflict to rectify like most of the issues facing American society. Because here's what's going to happen. The political tensions are going to ramp up so much that there's just going to be some sort of civil conflict, or like I don't want to say civil war because that's I don't want to imagine that, but I could imagine something like the Italian Years of Lead, or maybe like the Troubles in Northern Ireland, or like there is mass political violence, and then we get a stronger man to emerge, and he sorts that out. Because when you look at it this way, we were to say, oh, well, there's going to be post nationhood, and there's going to be like people won't know what to think. That just won't be allowed to go on peacefully because there's actors like who just simply won't stand by and let that happen. Simply put, and even again, because you're saying there's never been a time where America was so atomized and divided, but look at how similar periods end of division. Like, oh, we had the civil rights movement. Guess what? People elected Nixon. We sorted that out. People, because you say it's never been this bad.
I mean Nixon, like
American,
that's not like I feel like civil rights. I mean the whole kind of like issue that like appeared there hasn't even been like resolved recently. Like Nixon kind of like offered like a short-term solution in terms of like crime, but like I don't think he solved that. And this is kind of like the interpretation that like a lot of people have, especially on the right of like American history, that like everything kind of like started this kind of polarization kind of started in the 60s and it hasn't really been resolved yet. And I think there's like a certain truth in that. But like, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you can go on.
I'm gonna be honest with you, but I feel like you're kind of like overestimating just how unique this is, because you might be saying it's never been this bad, but you don't realize you don't realize this. The Civil War happened. The 1960s, the early 70s happened. 1971 saw over 2,000 bombings, like Black Panthers, Lone Wolves. Over 2,000 bombings happened that year, if I remember correctly. There's and these are like domestic terrorist attacks, like a Black Panthers, KKK, those types. People back in Alabama, like little kids, were getting attacked with dogs. Let's not pretend like it's never been this bad. And here's how it usually ends. Here's how it ends. Because people don't just let post nationhood happen. Because that's not good for the government. That's not good for any potential strongmen. That's not good for the economy. Because, look, corporations, like if post nationhood happens, like nobody wants post nation. Most powerful actors in society just wouldn't stand for the nation devolving into some sort of vague post nationhood where people just shoot up schools or whatever. They would take decisive action. And here's what year here's what year happens. There's either going to be a somewhat peaceful resolution and we get a strong man like a Nixon or a Lincoln or Trump, because I feel like the Bible says well, John the Baptist, which was like Jesus' cousin, he was speaking to people and he was talking about Jesus and he was saying, and the person asked him, hey, does Jesus also baptize people? He said, yes, he's going to baptize you stronger than I ever could with fire. So what's going to happen is after Trump, political tensions are going to start peaking. They're going to start rising again. And what we're going to witness an age of conflict. And in this age of conflict, what happens is, look, the the strongmen, the government, they tie up loose ends, if you know what I mean. So there's either going to be some sort of civil conflict, like in Northern Ireland or Italy, and or just like a full out civil war. But the results of both are going to be rather inconsequential because it's going to end with society becoming like a Bonapartist. It's going to end with society becoming some shade of Bonapartism, where democracy is mostly co-opted into like a strong man. Because look, just devolving into post nationhood is good for nobody. Even if we were to look at it from a purely practical standpoint, what good would Amazon gain to just let the nation collapse? What good would any bigwig actor on the Fortune 500 or in the government gain? There's
Yeah,
plenty of powerful actors
uh, uh,
with arms who could take action and install a strong man. And there's plenty of people who would vote for a strong man to get us into like a Bonapartist society. And I feel like Yang is the left wing version of that. Trump is the right wing version of that. This type of strong man, post political society, post political type of politics that's going to turn America into a society that resembles Bonapartist France, the Roman Empire, China, modern China, just like totally realign things.
yeah, and I mean, I agree with you. I mean, post nationhood it wouldn't benefit anyone. I mean, I'm not arguing for it, but I do think that like it's kind of the direction America is heading right now, and I mean, you can mention that like I mean, yeah, sure, America is not even it's not in it's not in the Civil War. It's also probably not as bad as like the 60s. Um, but I mean, that's like looking at it from like a strictly kind of like material quantifiable perspective, like how much literal violence is happening in the streets. And the thing I'm concerned about is how how does the problem of identity fit into this? Because I mean, that's kind of like the underlying thing, you know, like American identity is kind of like becoming like um, you know, atomized. That's what my point is. Because like for example, in the Civil War, I mean, after the Civil War, you had like a lot of efforts for like reconciliation. I mean, like Southern, um, you know, between the Union and the Confederates, and that's something that like um, would literally never happen. And like if like the Civil War happened today and it ended, like that wouldn't happen today, because like the underlying American identity that existed back then and that like everyone had does not really exist in the same way anymore. You know, back then people had like a shared viewpoint about like what being an American is. Um, People had like this shared, you know, collective consciousness. Um, and you know, like even in the '60s, I mean, you know, obviously to a different degree, I feel like even in the '60s that existed. But like right now, I feel like that's kind of disappearing, and you know, it's amplified by technology. It's amplified by the fact we live in a completely different economical system to like any previous stage of economic development. I mean, namely, uh, globalized capitalism. It's affected by the fact, you know, by migration. It's affected by like everything, and you know those are problems. That is a problem I'm saying has never existed before. All right, like the violence. I mean the polarization itself. Yeah, sure. I mean there's definitely been periods in American history that have had that, but like those problems were then eventually resolved because people still had that underlying identity, which is American identity, right? So right now, if a civil conflict were to happen, I don't feel like America would be able to come together after that. I don't think that like the underlying American identity would be able to kind of like reconcile that. Um, and you know it's exactly because of all of the reasons I'm mentioning, and you know I have no idea what like uh, a post nationhood society would look like. Like I have no idea, and I don't think any of us can know. But the thing is, like we are, you know, I don't. I think that both of us can agree that like you know there's probably gonna be more escalation. It may lead into a civil conflict, but like the ability that America would have to get out of that and to eventually enter the next historical stage, like I feel like that's kind of like the problem there is that like the you know there's no unifying thing anymore. I mean there's no unifying value or kind of like anything, you know.
I mean, I know how like I'm mentioning like oh well, like underlying American identity, etc., etc. But I know this might sound funny, but if you were to ask me, I think that there's like an American monoculture because people say, oh well, American culture is permeating the world. I feel like there definitely is an American culture that exists, and we're seeing it worldwide. And there's definitely an American aesthetic, and I feel like America, funnily enough, is the most unified. It is the most I'm not saying this like oh well there's no political conflict, but if we were to say like oh well just like how much people think of themselves as American, well America since like the 1970s actually has little to no like regional sectionalism. Because like I feel like when it comes down to politics, like if there is a shift between like the left and the right, and there was like a little spat between like oh well the left is fighting the right, then that ends with America reunifying. That's ultimately what happens. Because you just say, well, even if you were to say, well, like there's going to be no reconciliation, then guess what happens? The right just purges the left, or the left just purges the right. So America will ultimately be rebuilt as a society in the image of the victors of said conflict. That's one thing we need to acknowledge. There's going to be mass retribution. And number two, I mentioned, like you said, like America has tensions, China has tensions. The thing with China is that those tensions are far more regional. Like, oh, it's like Shanghai doesn't like interior China. But with America, it's more like the left doesn't like the right. And think of it this way: if you're a Shanghai regionalist, that means you just like people from Shang. I'm not. I'm just gonna explain like this. That means you want Shanghai to be its own thing, and you just don't like China, or you just don't. Well, you don't like China in general, the Chinese government, because you think that they're oppressing Shanghai. But if you look at it from like a right-left perspective, you would think, well, I'm right wing, and I don't like the left wing, and this ultimately leads to a conflict that then I think will be fratricidal, but the victors of it will be able to enact a vision for society. And I feel like that the winners of said conflict will be mostly populistic. Because even if we were to look at it, we're starting to see like a general consensus emerge. And the general consensus right now is populism good. And that's a major realignment in the Trump era. Because I feel like we're beginning like a new stage with the Trump era. And we're going to begin like a phase for like Trump is going to basically have a system where he can hold on to power, his successors hold on to power, and that's going to lead to a brief like expansion. He said he wants to go to the moon by 2030. He said he wants to do these other things, and I feel like, oh well, if this happens in America, it's going to start expanding for a bit, and people are going to start focusing more on just populism in general. But then we're going to start to plateau, and there's going to be a major civil conflict that could happen. I predict that like the major culture war probably started with Gamergate. If we're talking about like the culture war and all that stuff, I would say that probably started with Gamergate, 2015. So let's say it started with Gamergate or like the Pulse nightclub shooting. It started sometime in 2015, 2016, which means that it's still building up, building up. It's kind of like the civil rights movement, kind of like the Civil War. And assuming that we like allow it to ferment in society, it should peak sometime in the next maybe 20 to 30 years. And I think that there still is a bit of time before any sort of mass civil conflict. And I think we're starting to see this mass civil conflict begin in some cases over issues like abortion. So, yeah, when the conflict begins, I would like to think that it would be maybe like 15, 20 years out. And I really don't want there to be a second civil war. But if a second civil war were to happen, what you would witness is again mass retribution by the victors against those who lost the conflict. And on top of that, you would also see American expansion because, like it or not, the West, I believe, since World War II has been in a state of decline. And well, not like, oh, it's just going to die, but I feel like the West has been declining morally. So the West, over time, is dealing with this conflict. Because this isn't just the U.S. in general. This is the West in general. Because there's conflicts in Europe over immigration. There's conflicts all across the West. And I feel like there's going to be a stage where like one faction in America and Europe is going to prevail. Because you're saying post-nationhood. Because you see, that eventually comes to a head. That's just a code word for like, oh, you're just leading up to a civil war. Because you can't have any sort of peaceful atomization and destruction of society. That's not how societies work. You can't destroy society by mostly peaceful means. You can't just do that. There's always going to be some sort of push. There's always going to be some sort of action taken against that because you can't just destroy society through peaceful means. So what's going to happen is if this continues, there's going to be a stage where it's going to be a civil conflict, and it's going to be retribution by the victors of said conflict to impose their vision of America, to impose their vision of the West on people. Because even if you were to look at it from just like the American perspective, as I told you, there were like multiple strongmen in American history. One Lincoln, two Roosevelt, three Nixon, four is Trump. I mean, you could count Woodrow Wilson, but ultimately, these are just strongmen who work within the system. But as time goes on, they're going to realize that it's more expendable, not more expendable, sorry, more worthwhile to just break the system past the point. Yeah, because I'm not concerned about any sort of post nationhood or balkanization. Maybe I'm concerned about civil war, but I'm not concerned the idea of America will stop existing. I'm more concerned about the idea there's just going to be, again, a transition towards an autocracy or a vaguely political society. Not to mention the fact that we're already starting to see the end of European autonomy because Trump is proposing dividing NATO into about four strategic operation zones that would be like subservient to U.S. interests. Well, it wouldn't really be, that would basically like extensions of U.S. interests because they'd have like Trump supporting parties and this, that, and the third. So the restrictions on Europe are being tightened and their funding that they're supposed to get to NATO is being raised. And lots of that is going so the US can personally fund their own forces. So what you're about to witness is the US is going to tighten down more on Europe until eventually Europe is just like American states and all but name. And eventually there might just be an annexation. And America at home is going to start becoming more autocratic. So in a few decades, you can easily see a road where like America and NATO, after a sort of dramatic civil conflict in the West, has been just rebuilt into like an autocratic, like one state. Simply put, post nationhood just doesn't happen peacefully. You can't just peacefully dissolve a society. That's not how it works. You just don't peacefully dissolve society through post nationhood because you because that's how we got the prelude to the Civil War. There was a post nationhood because people thought themselves as Southerners and Northerners and Westerners. There was a post nationhood, but guess what happened?
Yeah, well, I mean, um, I don't want to talk like more. I don't want to keep talking about like the issue of like post nationhood after what I'm gonna say. Um, but when I'm talking about post nationhood, I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about a situation in which the American state disappears or in which the United States as a whole disappears, because I mean, that's the state, all right? And, people are still gonna be nominally American or whatever. Um, what I mean is rather that, like, everyone is gonna have a different approach to being American. And that is something that hasn't happened like a lot in history because like even the example of like the prelude to the Civil War, I feel like it's not really like very similar. Um, because I feel like back then, I mean, there was still like a shared kind of concept of like an American history, a American culture, a kind of like American way of life, and the main kind of like division, which was regional, it was eventually resolved. But I feel like right now, we are in a pretty different spot. Um, Mostly due to the fact that like literally every economical development in the world has like tended towards increasing like the atomization of society and of individuals, and the way the concept of the nation is gonna kind of like change over the next decades or so. Uh, I call it post nationhood because I feel like the concept of kind of like a unified nation is gonna become kind of useless in a world in which the economy is globalized, in which everyone has access to the same technology, that has like the same discourse, and that has like the same culture, which you know comes from American monoculture. I'll give you that. Um, but I actually think that like this kind of ties into your idea of like America eventually, you know, having like this kind of like control over Europe and eventually creating a sort of like um, imperium. And I feel like that's also a result of post nationhood, because by doing that, I mean, you would basically be eliminating the traditional, I mean, concept of a nation, and you would be kind of like globalizing American culture. And so, I think you could like kind of elaborate on your kind of viewpoint in regards to that. Like this kind of like, I mean, let's say that like for the sake of argument, I mean, you know, there was a civil collapse. America somehow uh, reunited after that, and America is now under a strong man or whatever. And I mean, how does that look like? Like what is kind of like the thing you're describing? I mean, that's something I wanted to ask you.
Well, first off, when I say like, oh, there's like Bonapartism, post-politicism, did I first off, did I tell you about like my distinction that post-politics doesn't mean no politics? Did I tell you like why that distinction matters?
Yeah.
Okay. So when I say like American autocracy and like oh Bonapartism and this that and the third, I don't mean like Stalinism. I don't mean that you're just gonna be chilling and then death squad's just gonna come and freaking choke you on your bed. I mean that like it's gonna be more like just imagine Putinism. It's basically just gonna be like autocracy. Like the leader has more power than should be allowed under the Constitution and has way more authority than they usually would have. It's kind of something like, oh, well, there's a really powerful leader, but it's okay because the people like supported this. So, like, think of it like Napoleonic France or anything like that. So, I don't think there's going to be like a totalitarian mess. Second off, here's what I think will be one thing AI. I feel like when it comes to AI, that's going to be like one of those major things that sparks conflict in society. Uh, I'm not trying to say that AI is going to replace all jobs, but I do believe that like the current social issues we're facing right now could be compounded by the rise of AI sometime in say the 2030s, which would displace a lot of jobs and cause more societal tensions. And I feel like Yang had blue Caesarism or blue Bonapartism, where he said, look, we're going to do human centered capitalism. We're going to give people free money. We're going to do this. So I feel like we could easily see something. We're like, oh, well, the government, on top of being like autocratic, maintains power by, say, a universal basic income. Because I feel like universal basic income could be a Trojan horse to implement an autocracy. Because first off, do you think that AI is going to be a major issue in the future that takes off jobs from American workers?
Well, I feel like AI, I mean, it's a good question. I think that it's also like something unprecedented, cause this literally like could like impact like every sector of the economy. Um, I also don't think that like it's gonna like take all the jobs, but it's definitely gonna like completely restructure the way that like we think of the economy. And Elon Musk has been like talking about like how this could like actually like um create like a kind of like sort of like abundance. And like I don't think he's completely wrong about that. Actually, I think there's like a certain chance that like AI could like eventually develop that. But like I mean, what's your take on like AI? I mean,
Personally, I think that AI is going to be a deciding issue in like how we get to this Bonaparte that I'm mentioning. Because I think that like UBI, Universal Basic Income, is going to be definitely one thing that like any regime would give out in order to assure up support. It's going to be like, look, we're giving out free money in order to alleviate the AI issue. So that's one thing. But I do think that AI will probably mostly be used for military purposes and stuff like that. Of course,
yeah,
you said
it
that
may
this is
even
going to be
like be the I mean, it may be like the defining factor in like how the ruling class is like gonna consolidate their support. Because like a lot of people are saying, I mean, a lot of people think that um, like this is eventually gonna like end in like the collapse of the ruling class or whatever. But like I think that like if anything, I mean, AI would be like the kind of like thing that like keeps them in power. And as you're saying, it could be like their way to not only keep power but like also to keep like the population in line.
yeah. I seriously doubt that AI is going to be some big societal collapse. 'Cause I feel like if there is a societal collapse, like it'll come hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
But there's like still a bit of like things that the U.S. is going to do. One, we're going to fix. Well, we aren't. I'm not going to say fix because like I don't think that like a China style autocracy is like a magic band-aid that would fix the problems. But here are the major things I could see happening in the future. One, the U.S. has a phase of civil conflict, and AI becomes a wedge issue in this conflict. The winners of this conflict will probably purge their political opposition, give out thousands of dollars a year to shore up support, and consolidate American control over Europe and Japan. And after we get that, China is probably on the decline because of issues I've mentioned later. So I think that like say like this is like just a real picture a few decades out. We could easily see like a NATO federation or super state controlling most of the world's resources and energy under an American Western monoculture. I mean, it won't last forever. It won't last forever. But I do believe that there will be some sort of monocultural empire composed of the US, Europe, Japan, and a good bit of Asia that will probably form in the next century with how the trajectory is going.
Yeah. All right. So I think we're probably gonna end the discussion now because we are at 1 hour and 30 minutes, and I didn't really want this to like extend further than like 50 minutes. Uh, but I feel like this is a topic we could talk about in a future video actually. So you know,
Mm.
uh, I don't know if you want to say like anything else to kind of like conclude with your viewpoint, but like for the sake of the video's length, I mean, I'm gonna um, I don't have anything else to say in regards to that.
Well, here's my major viewpoint right here. I feel like I don't want to be the prophet of doom. I feel like that there is hope left in the future. I don't just want to be that guy saying, "Oh, it's gonna be fire and brimstone. Run to the hills. People are gonna start dying." But I do believe that there will be some sort of strife in the future, and that it will be resolved because history has a general direction that we've seen before. Ultimately,
Yeah,
and here's how it will end. It usually ends with resolutions, whether we like it or not. So do not think we are in the end of history. We are simply living in an era of problems that will see an eventual resolution. That's all I have to say.
All right, so that's it for the video. I mean, Robby J's channel will be in the description. But yeah,
Yeah.
we are probably gonna make another video about this in the future because this is a pretty interesting conversation. But yeah, that's it. So
Of course.
thank you very much for accepting the interview, Robby.
Yeah, thank you.